My name is Nathan Brooks. I am 71 years old, and I learned something about betrayal far later in life than I ever wanted to. It never arrives wearing the face of an enemy. It usually comes wearing the smile of someone you once carried on your shoulders. For 43 years, I built Brooks Custom Homes in Asheville, North Carolina. We started with one pickup truck, 2 toolboxes, and a dream that looked far too small to scare anyone. My wife Margaret believed in that dream before I did. While I spent my days raising houses from empty lots, she built something even harder. She built a family that I believed nothing could ever break. 8 months ago, I buried her. The doctors called it a sudden brain aneurysm. They told me there had been nothing anyone could have done. One evening, she was sitting beside me on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. Before sunrise the next morning, she was gone. People often ask what grief feels like. I wish I had a simple answer. For me, it felt like walking into every room expecting to hear her voice, only to be greeted by silence that somehow grew louder every day. The only place where that silence softened was a small log cabin tucked away on a wooded hillside about 20 minutes outside Asheville. Margaret bought the neglected property more than 20 years earlier. Everyone thought she was crazy. The roof leaked. The porch leaned to one side. Half the windows were boarded shut. But every weekend, she worked on it with her own hands. She sanded every floorboard, repaired every window frame, planted every wildflower that bloomed around the front porch. She always said the cabin reminded her that broken things deserved patience before they deserved judgment. After she passed away, I drove there almost every morning with a cup of black coffee. I would sit on the porch, listen to birds waking up in the trees, and for a little while, I could almost believe she was still inside humming while she made breakfast. Then one Monday morning, I turned onto the gravel driveway and slammed on the brakes. The cabin was gone. Not burned. Not damaged. Gone. The trees still stood exactly where they had always been. The flower beds Margaret planted still surrounded the clearing. But the cabin itself had vanished, leaving behind nothing except a bare concrete foundation and fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the wet earth. I stood there frozen, unable to breathe. I thought thieves had somehow stolen an entire house. I had no idea the truth was far worse. Because the person who took it already had a key that I wish I could tell you I called the police first. I did not. Something deep inside me already knew who had done it. Only 3 people still had access to that property after Margaret passed away. Me, our longtime groundskeeper, who had been visiting his grandchildren in Florida all week, and my son, Ryan. I pulled out my phone and called him. He answered on the 5th ring. "Dad, can I call you back? Vanessa and I are boarding." "Boarding where?" "Our flight to Italy." His voice sounded cheerful, relaxed, like life was exactly the way he wanted it to be. I looked across the empty foundation where my wife's cabin had stood for more than 2 decades. "Ryan," I asked quietly, "where is your mother's cabin?" There was a pause. Not a frightened pause. An irritated one. Finally he sighed. "I figured you'd notice sooner or later." My heart began pounding. "What did you do?" "I sold it." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. "You what?" "I sold the cabin, Dad. A developer wanted the timber frame and the reclaimed materials. The land is still yours. They just moved the structure." I leaned against my truck because my knees suddenly felt 20 years older. "That cabin wasn't yours." "I know what you're going to say." "No," I replied softly. "You don't." He kept talking anyway. It had been sitting empty for months. Nobody lived there. It was costing money to maintain. I made a practical decision. Practical. That single word hurt more than I expected. Margaret had poured 20 years of weekends, holidays, and late evenings into that place. She repaired every beam with her own hands. She refused to replace old cedar unless it absolutely could not be saved. She believed history deserved respect. To Ryan, it had become a line on a balance sheet. "Why?" I asked. "We needed the money." "For what?" He laughed awkwardly. "Vanessa's been wanting to see Europe forever. We finally booked the trip. Business class. A couple of weeks through Italy and France. Life's short, Dad. Life's short." The words landed like stones. Margaret had been dead for only 8 months. "I never gave you permission." "Dad." His tone became impatient. "Come on. One day, everything you own is coming to me anyway. I just moved one piece a little earlier than planned." I closed my eyes. Not because I was angry, because I suddenly realized this wasn't an impulsive mistake. Ryan had already convinced himself he owned things that were never his. As the boarding announcement echoed through the airport behind him, he ended the conversation with words I will never forget. You'll understand eventually. Then he hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time. The cabin was gone. My son was somewhere between North Carolina and Europe. And for the first time in his 39 years, I wondered whether I had raised a man or simply mistaken entitlement for confidence that I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret standing on the porch of that cabin with a paintbrush in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. She always smiled whenever she caught me watching her work. She used to say that every home had a heartbeat. You just have to listen long enough to hear it. By sunrise, I had convinced myself there was nothing left to save. The cabin was gone. Ryan was halfway across the Atlantic. Whatever had happened was finished. Then my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the local area code caught my attention. This is Nathan Brooks. A calm voice answered. Mr. Brooks, my name is Daniel Mercer. I believe we need to talk about your cabin. My grip tightened around the phone. How did you get this number? It wasn't difficult. Everyone in the construction business around Asheville knows who you are. I stepped onto my back porch. What do you want? I was the buyer. Those 4 words hit harder than I expected. I didn't know the property belonged to you until yesterday evening. Your son presented paperwork saying he had authority to sell the structure. The documents looked legitimate at first, but something didn't sit right with me. My heartbeat slowed. So the sale isn't complete? No. Hope returned for the first time since the previous morning. I paid a deposit, but the remaining balance is sitting in escrow until ownership is verified. I don't release 6-figure transactions without confirming every signature. I leaned against the porch railing. So why are you calling now? There was a brief silence. Because my crew found something inside the cabin before we finished dismantling it. What kind of something? A locked metal box. I frowned. It was hidden behind the stone fireplace. Whoever placed it there never intended for a demolition crew to find it. My mind immediately went to Margaret. She knew every inch of that cabin. Every nail. Every loose floorboard. Every hidden corner. If it belonged to your wife, Daniel continued, I think you should be the first person to see what's inside. An hour later, I pulled into a large warehouse on the outskirts of town. The massive cedar beams from Margaret's cabin had been carefully stacked in rows. Seeing them separated from one another felt like looking at pieces of someone's life laid across a concrete floor. Daniel greeted me without saying much. He simply led me to a heavy workbench. A small fireproof lockbox rested on top. The lid had already been opened. Inside were 3 things: a flash drive, a thick handwritten notebook, and an envelope with my name written across the front. I would have recognized Margaret's handwriting anywhere. My hands began shaking before I even touched the letter. Daniel quietly stepped toward the door. I'll give you some privacy. The room fell silent. I opened the envelope. The very first sentence stole the air from my lungs. Nathan, if you are reading this, someone inside our own family has already betrayed us. I sat alone in that warehouse with Margaret's letter resting on my knees. For several minutes, I could not bring myself to read another word. It felt wrong, almost as if opening the letter meant admitting she was truly gone. Finally, I took a deep breath and continued. Nathan, if this letter reaches you, it means I was right to worry. Please do not confront anyone until you know the whole truth. What I found is much bigger than one bad decision, and I am afraid the people involved have already convinced themselves they deserve everything we built. My chest tightened. Margaret had never been suspicious by nature. She believed people usually made mistakes because they were scared, not because they were cruel. If she had written those words, she must have been absolutely certain. I picked up the notebook next. It was not a diary. It was a record. Every page contained dates, invoices, account numbers, handwritten notes, and observations she had gathered over nearly 2 years. At first, none of it made much sense. Then the pattern began to appear. The same subcontractors, the same invoices, the same unusually large payments. Again, and again, and again, Margaret had circled dozens of transactions in blue ink. Beside one of them she had written, "This invoice was paid twice." Another page read, "The supplier says they never billed us for this amount. Something is wrong." Further into the notebook, her handwriting became more urgent. "Kevin keeps blaming software errors. 3 accounting mistakes are believable. 30 are not. Kevin Lawson, our chief operating officer. I had worked beside Kevin for almost 15 years. He started as a project manager fresh out of college and slowly earned every promotion. I trusted him enough to run the company whenever I traveled. According to Margaret's notes, he had personally approved nearly every questionable payment. But the next page stopped me cold. I do not believe Kevin is acting alone. Someone inside the family has access to approvals that should never have been signed this easily. Do not accuse Kevin until you know who benefits the most. I closed the notebook and stared across the warehouse. Pieces of Margaret's cabin surrounded me, the place where she had hidden all of this. She had discovered something so serious that she secretly documented every detail instead of telling me immediately. Why? Because she wanted proof. Not guesses. Not accusations. Proof. My eyes moved toward the flash drive still, lying inside the lockbox. A small white label had been attached to it. In Margaret's careful handwriting were only 6 words. Everything you need is here. I slipped the drive into my pocket. At that moment, I knew this story had nothing to do with a cabin anymore. Someone had been stealing from the company Margaret, and I spent 4 decades building. And somewhere inside those files was the name of the person she had been trying so desperately to protect me from discovering that I drove straight from Daniel Mercer's warehouse to the office of our family attorney. Emily Carter had represented Margaret and me for nearly 20 years. She had handled business contracts, estate planning, and every legal problem that came our way. More importantly, she had been Margaret's closest friend outside our family. She looked up the moment I walked into her office. "Nathan, what happened?" Without saying a word, I placed the notebook, the letter, and the flash drive on her desk. An hour later, we were sitting beside a forensic accountant named Olivia Bennett. She specialized in tracing financial fraud through corporate records. Olivia plugged Margaret's flash drive into an isolated computer and quietly began opening folder after folder. Emails, scanned invoices, bank statements, approval forms, spreadsheets. Everything Margaret had suspected was backed by documentation. The room grew quieter with every file. Olivia rarely spoke while she worked, but after nearly 2 hours, she finally leaned back in her chair. "Your wife was incredibly thorough." Emily nodded. "Can you tell how much is missing?" Olivia shook her head. "Not yet. But this wasn't random." She enlarged one spreadsheet. Every suspicious payment followed nearly the same pattern. Small amounts at first. $5,000. $8,000. $12,000. Amounts unlikely to attract attention during routine audits. Then, over time, the transfers became much larger. $50,000. $90,000. $120,000. Whoever designed the system understood exactly how internal accounting reviews worked. They were testing the limits, Olivia said quietly. When nobody noticed, they became bolder. She opened another folder labeled Executive Approvals. Dozens of authorization forms appeared. Most carried Kevin Lawson's digital approval. That much matched Margaret's notebook. Then Olivia froze. She zoomed in on a second signature appearing beneath Kevin's name. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, she turned the monitor toward us. "Nathan, I think you need to see this yourself." My eyes settled on the electronic signature. Ryan Brooks. My own son's name. I felt every ounce of strength leave my body. Emily immediately reached for my arm. "Slow down," she said softly. "A signature alone doesn't prove intent." Olivia agreed. Executives sometimes approve documents without realizing what's buried inside them. I stared at the screen without blinking. Not Ryan. Both women looked at me. My son reads every contract, every proposal, every investment agreement. He negotiates everything down to the smallest detail. Silence filled the room. Olivia continued tracing the money. Another 20 minutes passed before she opened the final banking records. The receiving account did not belong to Kevin. It did not belong to Ryan. It belonged to a holding company registered 18 months earlier. The registered owner was listed in plain black letters. Vanessa Brooks, Ryan's wife. Olivia slowly removed her glasses. "I've finished the preliminary calculation." "How much?" She looked directly into my eyes. "Approximately $1.8 million over the last 3 years. Nobody spoke. Outside the office window, people walked along the sidewalk as if it were just another ordinary afternoon. Inside that room, the family Margaret had spent her entire life protecting had just shattered into pieces. Emily wanted to contact federal investigators immediately. Olivia agreed. Both of them believed we already had enough evidence to begin a formal case. But there was one thing I needed before any lawyer filed a single document. I needed to hear my son tell me the truth, or at least give him one final chance to do it himself. Ryan and Vanessa returned from Europe 4 days later. I called that afternoon. "Come by the house tonight," I said. "We need to talk." Ryan sounded relieved. I figured this was about the cabin. "It is." That was all I said. At 7 o'clock sharp, they pulled into the driveway. Ryan walked in carrying an expensive leather travel bag over one shoulder. Vanessa followed behind him, smiling politely as though nothing had happened. For a brief moment, I remembered Ryan as a little boy running through unfinished houses wearing one of my oversized work gloves. I wondered where that child had gone. We sat around the same dining table where Margaret had hosted every Thanksgiving for more than 30 years. Nobody touched the coffee. Nobody spoke. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "Dad, I know you're upset about the cabin, but I already explained everything." I reached into the folder beside my chair. Without saying a word, I placed Margaret's notebook on the table, then the flash drive, then several printed bank statements. Finally, the approval forms carrying Ryan's electronic signature. The color drained from his face. Vanessa stopped smiling. "What is all this?" Ryan asked. "You tell me." He glanced toward his wife before answering. "I've never seen those papers." I slid another page across the table. "This transfer moved $120,000. Another page. This one moved $90,000. Then another. And this one." Ryan swallowed hard. "I signed hundreds of approvals every month." So did Kevin. His voice became louder. "If Kevin slipped something through accounting, how would I know?" I looked directly into his eyes. "Your mother knew." The room fell completely still. I opened Margaret's notebook to the final pages. She spent almost 2 years documenting every transaction. Ryan stared at the handwriting without touching the notebook. I continued quietly. "She planned to tell me everything." Vanessa suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous." "No," I replied calmly. "What's ridiculous is believing Margaret Brooks spent 20 years rebuilding a cabin by hand and another 2 years gathering evidence, just to invent a story." Emily stepped into the dining room from the study where she had been waiting. Ryan looked stunned. Then Olivia entered behind her carrying another folder. Neither of them had spoken a single word until that moment. Ryan slowly turned toward me. "You set this up?" "No." I shook my head. "Your mother did." I stood for the first time since they arrived. "My wife protected this family until the very end." My voice remained steady, even though my heart was breaking. "You spent the last 3 years stealing from everything she believed in." Neither Ryan nor Vanessa answered. For the first time in their lives, silence told me more than any excuse ever could. The truth unraveled faster than I expected. Ryan and Vanessa left my house that night without another word. Emily advised me not to contact them again. Every conversation from that point forward needed to go through legal counsel. The following morning, Kevin Lawson agreed to meet us. He walked into the conference room looking exhausted. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes never met mine. Emily laid the evidence across the table one document at a time. Margaret's notebook, the accounting records, the wire transfers, the shell company. Kevin looked at everything in silence. When Emily finished, she folded her hands. "Kevin, this is your opportunity to tell the truth." For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Then he quietly nodded. "It started with Ryan." I closed my eyes. Some small part of me had continued hoping there was another explanation. There wasn't. Kevin rubbed both hands across his face. "Ryan came to me about 4 years ago. He said the company was making millions while he was being paid like an employee instead of treated like an owner. He believed he deserved more." I remained silent. "He already had the plan," Kevin continued. "The fake vendors, the duplicate invoices, the small transfers that nobody would question. I told him it was illegal." Kevin let out a bitter laugh. "He told me it was temporary. He said he'd pay everything back before anyone noticed." Emily asked quietly, "And Vanessa?" Kevin nodded. "She understood finance better than either of us. She created the holding company. She opened the accounts. She handled every transfer after the money left the business." I felt physically sick, not because strangers had stolen from me, because every decision had been made around family dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, all while Margaret smiled across the table, completely unaware of how close she already was to discovering everything. Then Kevin said something I will never forget. About 3 weeks before Margaret passed away, Ryan became nervous. I looked up. What do you mean? He asked if anyone had been reviewing old invoices. My heartbeat slowed. I told him I didn't know. Kevin swallowed hard. He said his mother had started asking questions. The room became unbearably quiet. I thought he was overreacting. Kevin's voice cracked. Then the transfers suddenly became much larger. He wanted to move as much money as possible before someone shut everything down. Nobody spoke for several seconds. I stared at the empty chair across the table, the chair where Ryan had sat during hundreds of company meetings. I could not stop asking myself one question. Did my son know his mother was getting close to the truth? Or was it simply another coincidence that he panicked at exactly the wrong moment? I still do not know the answer. Perhaps I never will. But one thing had become painfully clear. Margaret had not been imagining anything. She had uncovered the truth almost entirely on her own. She simply ran out of time before she could place the evidence in my hands. 6 months later, I found myself sitting in the last row of a federal courtroom. It was strangely quiet. Not because nothing important was happening, because every person inside understood that no sentence could repair what had already been broken. Kevin Lawson accepted responsibility early. He pleaded guilty, cooperated with investigators, and helped recover much of the stolen money. The judge acknowledged his cooperation, but reminded him that choosing to stop breaking the law was not the same as choosing to obey it from the beginning. Then Ryan and Vanessa stood before the court. Neither of them looked like the confident couple who had boarded a flight to Europe only months earlier. The evidence spoke far louder than any attorney could. The forged sale documents, the shell company, the hidden transfers, Margaret's handwritten notebook, the flash drive she had protected inside the walls of the cabin she loved. Everything fit together with painful precision. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Both Ryan and Vanessa were found guilty. As the judge read the sentence, I kept my eyes forward. I did not look at my son. Not because I hated him, because I was afraid that if I did, I would remember the little boy who used to hold my hand while we walked through construction sites together. Some memories deserve to stay untouched. Nearly all of the stolen money was eventually recovered through frozen accounts and seized assets. Emily asked what I wanted to do with it. I already knew the answer. Margaret had spent her life restoring forgotten places. She believed history mattered because every generation deserved to know where it came from. So instead of folding the money back into the company, I created the Margaret Brooks Heritage Foundation. The foundation helps preserve historic homes, restore community buildings, and provide grants to young craftsmen learning traditional woodworking and restoration skills. Every project carries Margaret's name. Every restored porch, every repaired window, every family that finds hope inside an old home receives a small piece of the kindness she spent her entire life giving away. As for the cabin, Daniel Mercer kept every beam exactly as he promised. Several months after the trial, I bought every piece back. Local builders volunteered their weekends. Former employees donated materials. Neighbors brought food, tools, and memories. Together, we rebuilt the cabin on the very same foundation where it had stood for more than 20 years. The first evening I sat on that familiar front porch again, the mountains looked exactly the way they had when Margaret first showed me the property decades earlier. The wind moved softly through the trees. For the first time since losing her, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. Betrayal had taken away my family as I once knew it. But it failed to erase the values Margaret spent a lifetime building. If there is one lesson I hope you carry from my story, it is this. An inheritance is never measured by what someone leaves behind. It is measured by the character they leave inside the people who choose to honor them. Money disappears. Buildings grow old. Even families can fall apart. But honesty, once lived with courage, can outlast every one of them. If this story meant something to you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family, resilience, and justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for spending your time with Silent Man. Until next time, take care of the people who truly earn your trust.